One of the things that these lobbyists were most keen on was to try and play down the ripple effects that all these crops are having out in the rest of the market. Now, before they tried to feed me full of propaganda, I really didn't know much about this topic. Unfortunately for them, I have an inquisitive mind, and I hit the dictionary, and I hit the web. I was shocked at what I found, and the big picture impact of some of these problems right now is just beyond imagination. These crops are causing problems, among other things, for the bee population. Well, that's no joke, those stories you've heard. It's important to understand the long-term ramifications if this all goes unchecked. Most of the nation's farming relies on bees and similar insects for pollination of their non-GMO crops. Much of the pollen from the GMO crops is genetically engineered to be sterile, so that Monsanto and the agro-businesses can exert yet another level of control over the farmers, just in case all of the lawsuits don't work. Well, the bees don't know the difference, and this infertile pollen is wreaking havoc on them. I've read reports that have indicated pollen is killing off bees through a variety of methods. For example, it's not as nutrient-rich as regular organic pollen, so the bees don't know this. And many hives aren't surviving the regular hibernation process. These hives of bees are literally starving to death in their sleep. These GMO crops that they take it from are frequently oversprayed with pesticides, many of which, remember, are carcinogens. So if they're potent enough to cause cancer in something as large as a human being, what do these people think they're going to do to something the size of a bee or a fly? Now, consider for a moment. Bees and insects are the primary method of pollination for organic crops, right? And they form an incredibly important function out in the larger food web. I mean, everybody who's taken 8th grade biology class understands this basic idea. Without them, we suffer cascade shortages across the food web. And before long, we're stuck with problems in the supply of everything from bread to animal feed. Now, this isn't going to say that we're going to run out of food and the whole planet's going to starve and die. You know, it is never too late to go back to organic farming. But what I'm worried about is the economic impact and catastrophe that this is going to cause, or has the potential to cause. Consider the pork and beef markets. Now, cow and pig farming, especially factory farming, relies on corn and insect-based feed. If the beef market were to collapse, or even just suffer a 20% dip for one fiscal quarter, that ripples off into the overall grocery market. Believe it or not, a tremendous proportion of our overall food industry depends on beef and pork. Even a lot of products that people buy that are certified vegan, diet friendly and everything, they contain trace amounts of proteins and whatnot and glycerin that are all grown out of beef and pork cultures. The food supply is so dependent on beef and pork that we've seen 2-to-1 impacts in fluctuations in cattle futures out into the overall food supply. I'm going to resist the urge here to go all wonky on you and start spouting off aggregate GDP numbers quarter over quarter, but consider for a moment how much, just the scope of how much of our economy really is centered upon the food industry in one way or another. Trucking, hospitality, cardboard and paper for the packaging, restaurants, disposable kitchen utensils, even seasonal farm equipment. It's very rarely communicated publicly exactly how fragile our national economy really is and how interconnected all of these different industries have become over the years, and how small fluctuations in one area can have disastrous effects elsewhere in the industry. Consider for a moment that the food industry nationally is between 15 and 20% of our national economy, depending on how you want to define the food industry. The Great Depression of the 1920s was caused by a 1-week collapse of only 5% of our national economy. I'll let you ponder that for a moment. As we're pondering that, there's more. The business policies that we talked about earlier lead to significantly reduced levels of biodiversity among our nation's crops. Instead of farmers being free to farm what they want, They're forced through economic forces to farm subsidized corn and soybeans. And after getting hooked into genetically modified seeds, their fields slowly become more and more infested with herbicide-resistant weeds and plants. So they're slowly getting more locked in to the herbicide-resistant crops, and the cycle perpetuates. It slowly leads to the growth and rise of superweeds, which are completely immune to herbicides, no matter how much methylethyl bad stuff gets dumped on them. And then the farmer's screwed, because no matter what they do to their field, they're infested with weeds and they can't get anything to grow. This leads to a seriously reduced biodiversity and puts our entire food supply and other sectors of our economy increasingly vulnerable to single-issue problems that have ripple effects. All it would take to trigger serious economic downturn would be for one new corn disease or one new form of bacteria to come along and gut our corn supply for so much as 60 days. And I guarantee you, you'd see panic out in the news and your 401ks would pay the price. As if all of this wasn't bad enough, there's another angle that almost nobody talks about. Production of these GMO seeds isn't exactly the most environmentally friendly operation in town. In fact, throughout Monsanto's long 100-year history, a lot of people don't realize they were actually founded in 1901 as a chemical company. They didn't have anything to do with food until the 1980s. Throughout their long history, they've never been economically friendly. They held a near monopoly on the production of the toxic chemical PCBs for over 40 years, and they were the primary manufacturer of Agent Orange for the U.S. government back before it was fell out of use. Several Monsanto factories, such as the one in Soda Springs and the one in Sauget, Iowa, are now EPA Superfund toxic waste cleanup sites. You and I are paying with our tax money to clean up their toxic waste. Now, I've touched on like 10 different things here, and there's nearly not enough time to go into exhaustive detail about all of these different topics.